There's nothing worse than being at the track after getting ready for it all week long, and you get up to your first test and you have a problem with the car. At the end of the season, last event, same thing happened to us. Went up to make a pass, no longer had my line lock or my bump. We got a couple of these in the car, and unfortunately one of them decided to fail. We had to come up with a fix, and a fix quick. We were able to fix it, but I don't want to have that problem again this year. So I'm going to go ahead and make a permanent fix and show you guys how to do that too. So my current setup utilizes 3 of these buttons, 1 on the center console, 2 on the steering wheel. The idea here is we're going to go ahead and just utilize 2. Just using the steering wheel and leaving the 1 on the center console as a spare in case we have an issue. But hopefully we don't run into that again. So the biggest part of this is figuring out how do I make 2 buttons do 4 or 5 functions. After we go and walk through the new setup, I'm going to show you guys exactly how to set up in the Holley, how to make these different things work using various parameters so it knows when you push that button, it does what you want it to. So the issue that you run into with these buttons is where it's potted here in the back on the steering wheel. Obviously you got to turn the steering wheel and you end up stretching this over and over and over again. What happened was the wires eventually became disconnected on the back here and this button no longer functioned as it should. This is my new setup and we'll get to that in just a second. But prior to that, let me set this off to the side. I was utilizing this MPI bracket for my 2 buttons. And the problem is I had no strain relief. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at my new setup and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So if I flip this over, you can now see that our corded lines have a little tab here that we zip tied this to, and then I also went ahead and put another zip tie down here at the bottom of the wheel. So as the steering wheel turns, the only thing that gets stretched is down here at the bottom where it should be. There's no longer any pull on the back of the buttons. So that's really the biggest issue that you run into running this type of button with no strain relief. As you can see, I've got a simple formula here, a simple solution if you will. Chris over at MassFab, if you've watched the channel, you know what he's capable of doing. Done some great stuff on the car. We went ahead and whipped up some of these brackets. When I was there to pick up the subframe, we came up with a solution to this, and he actually did a really cool thing where he took a picture where my hands were to make sure the button placement was perfect. So I'll pop that up on the screen so you guys can see it. Super cool how he did that. And then he cut out these brackets here, which we've got one on the car right now. So I went ahead and set up my steering wheel with the new stuff, but I want to show you something that I did change. So before, actually let's walk over to the car. Before, if you look right here, there is a button on my center console there. That was my trans brake button. So I had a trans brake here, okay? And then on the steering wheel, flip this over. This was my bump and my line lock. And then this was a separate button that was just for the parachute. What I'm gonna do now is only utilize the steering wheel. I'll probably leave that button in there as a backup. I can wire it so I can quickly change it if need to, if we have an issue with this one or this one. But for now, the idea is that we're gonna utilize everything in here. And again, I'll get to that and how that works in the Holley here in a moment. But what I want to show you guys is this new trans brake button. So this is, and hopefully I say it right, the Biondo 00 button. And the neat thing about this is, if you've never seen it, and now that I've showed you, if you've never seen it, you'll start noticing it on other people's cars. Yeah, it's a little big, a little bit more space than your little button here. But the cool thing is you can shim this with washers and really set this button up to how you want. And has a really tight tolerance on the button there. So what does that mean? Well, I've kind of prided myself, I think, on my reaction times. A lot of times reaction time is what wins a race. I love a good whole shot victory. I was watching the Lights Out this weekend and saw that. A couple good whole shot wins, which is awesome. But, any time that you can gain on the starting line is, just to your benefit. So try to take advantage of every piece of it. So we're going to play around with that Biondo button, see if it's something I like. A lot of people say they really like how it's kind of got a concave button in it, and with your gloves on, it makes it easy. I'm also going to test out and see if I like it on the steering wheel versus down on the center console. I've always felt like the button where I had it was an advantage. So hopefully I don't slow down using this, and if not, we'll change it back. But again, the main focus here that I want to talk about is just the fact that you can, set up these buttons in multitude of different ways with the Holley, but also making sure that you've got that strain relief. So that's key. Whether you need to, drill a hole in the steering wheel to put a zip tie through, or have a nice bracket like Chris made us. Motion Raceworks, if you've got an aftermarket steering column, they have a pretty sweet little connector that helps with the strain relief. I'm running the factory column on the 240, so we don't really have that option. Beyond that, the only other thing, let me show you something else. This bracket that I was running, the other reason we changed this bracket, this MPI bracket that fits on here, it's super thin aluminum. And I guess I was a little aggressive, but you can see I would have to bend this back after a pass. And it actually started to crack. It started to show some creasing in here. So I was nervous that eventually this was going to break also. So that was another reason why Chris made this for me. It's a little bit thicker, it's a little bit stronger, better setup. Also, let me overlay this. I'll show you the button placement with this one a little bit further in. Now with this, hand on the steering wheel, my thumb reaches before. I had to be kind of in here, kind of up here, etc. But that works a lot better. So again, key takeaway here, get your buttons set up where you want them, how you want them, and then the next step is obviously, well, you got to wire it, but then putting it in the Holley. So let's jump over to the Holley, and I'll show you guys how what we're going to do is this is going to control trans brake. This is going to control our line lock, our bump. I don't have scramble set up, but we could do scramble also, and parachute. And if you're not familiar with the parachute, what I'm talking about is I've got CO2 on this car for boost control, and I've got one of the Motion Raceworks CO2 handles. I love this thing because, one, I can keep both hands on the steering wheel going across the finish line, going a buck 60, 70, 80. I haven't gone 80, but that'd be nice. But it also still gives you the option of the manual. If there's an issue with it, you can hit the parachute handle manually. So, as I lose my mic, I really like that option. All right, I think that covers everything out here on the car physically. The next step is going to be checking out the Holley. Cool. Okay, so I've come inside so we can show you guys how we set this up in the Holley V6 software. First thing I want to do is talk about our inputs and outputs. And before we get to that, let's look at our trans brake setup. So in the boost configuration, if you have this marked here under the trans brake launch input, this check mark will automatically build you a trans brake setup. So down here at the bottom in the inputs and outputs, you'll see T-brake/launch, and I have that set up as ground. Now under inputs and outputs, we need to set up the other button. So the trans brake again is your right hand button. Your left hand button I have marked here as LL/bump/shoot. LL being line lock, bump of course, and then the parachute. Now I have this set up as a 20 volt input, and I'll show you here in a bit why we did that. So those are our only two inputs, right? We've got two buttons, two inputs, trans brake and the others. Okay. Now what we're focusing on is how do we get two inputs to correlate to four outputs. And really the trans brake one is pretty simple, right? It's 1 and 1. You've got one input from the trans brake button going to one output. All that requires is a bit of interruption from the bump button. So before we get to that, let's start at the top here. You see shoot deploy. So that in this instance I've got set up as a 12 volt output. So that goes to a MAC valve that activates the solenoid and pops open the chute. To show you how that works, it's first looking for the trans brake button to be disabled, so that makes sense, right? I'm not going to want to be pushing the trans brake button while I'm pushing the button to hit the chute. Additionally though, the vehicle also needs to see, of course, the chute button input, and this will make sense why it says above 9 volts, and then also it needs to see drive shaft speed. Now I'll back up and say, if you don't have your bump set up the way I do, you could just have this to see that this is active, right? Okay, so let's go back And now we're going to look at our line lock. So line lock, very similar to the chute, except in this instance, it's a ground. So we're sending a ground signal to our TBM line lock. So under configuration, again, we're going to see the computer wants to see no trans brake activated, and then it wants to see our button. So our button above 9 volts. And in this instance, I have it set up as front wheel speed below 5 miles an hour. So think about it. I roll through the water box. I've got my car set up. I pump the brakes. I hold down this button. So there's that piece of it. The car's not moving. It's below this. I obviously don't have the trans brake activated. I floor it, and the front wheels are locked. We do our burnout. I let go of the button and roll out. Okay. So below 5 miles an hour, no trans brake, line lock. Above 80, no trans brake, parachute. Now, with the bump output, you can see it says PWM minus. The reason I do this is I have my bump set up with PWM so I can just hold the button down and kind of do like the creep feature. Devin does a great job of this, showing how to set this up. I'll show you real quick kind of the basics of how mine is set up. But it's the whole reason why the other button is set up with the 20 volt instead of just, I typically just use a ground, but that's the 20 volt here. Also real quick, I set up the power that goes to this button is just set up as a 12 volt output from the ECU, and it's just activated anytime it sees the battery above 1 volt. So i.e. key on, this is getting power into the button. Out of the button, that's the physical pushing of the button. So with the bump, obviously it's going to want to see the trans brake enabled. So that's what separates the bump from the other two, is it has to see the trans brake. Now you see I've got this listed as OR. The other two were AND, so it wanted to see no trans brake and the speed plus the button. The reason I have this set up as OR is I have this to automatically activate the trans brake when my shifter is in the reverse gear position. So it's the specific trans brake I have, or the valve body, you have to have the trans brake on for it to actually move the vehicle in reverse. I have a position sensor set up on my transmission, so it knows it's in reverse and will automatically do this for me. So if you don't have something set up like that, you can pretty much ignore this piece of it. Okay. Now, PWM. So this is where it actually gets the activation to do the bump. So we've built a table here that on the bottom you see RPM. So this is going to correspond essentially to whatever RPM I'm at on the trans brake, because typically you're probably not bumping it until you're up on the two-step. But we have a wide window here because I kind of do some things where I overshoot and come back. And then on the left side you see 0 to 20, so this is volts. So when there's nothing being pushed, no button activated, you've got 0 volts coming through it. So think of that button as a switch. The computer's sending 20 or 12 volts on one side, but nothing's getting through until you hold that button down. Once you hold that button down, then it's going to pop up into the second half of the table, the upper part, and then this is a duty cycle that's getting sent out. So because it's PWM and a duty cycle, if I'm at 4,000 RPM, I'm sending 72.2, so that's not the full closure, if you will, on the trans brake, and that's what lets it move up. These numbers work for my car. You'll have to play with this. There's many different ways to do this, but I'm just quickly showing you why mine is a 12 volt, 20 volt setup. Again, if you're just using a regular trans brake setup with that button, you could set that button to just be ground activated into the PCM and then just make a much simpler setup for your bump. But I gotta be fancy, I guess. The key takeaway here is you've got two buttons. Trans brake, pretty simple. Sends a ground, out of the ground, activates the trans brake. Line lock, you need to see no trans brake, the line lock button pushed, and front wheel speed under a certain mile an hour. I use 5. Parachute, again, no trans brake. We've got the button pushed down above 80 mile an hour. It's going to pop the chute. Anything with no trans brake between those mile an hours, I can hit that button, won't do anything. If it sees a trans brake and I hit that button, It's going to do my bump output, which again corresponds to this duty cycle table. And depending on what RPM I'm at is how much duty cycle it's going to push. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, definitely drop them down below. If you've enjoyed this content so far, maybe it helps you, maybe you learned something, appreciate the follow, hit the thumbs up. That's probably it for the V6. Let's head back out to the garage. So I hope that helps explain a little bit of how I'm going to resolve my situation, and maybe it can keep you from having the same problem while you're out this season. If you have any other questions about how we set it up in the Holley or physically set it up in the car, be sure to comment down below. As always, thanks for the follow, and can't wait to see you out at the track.